At Lady Whitmore's spring garden party, Gertrude Wood stood in a gown the color of pale lilac, while 100 polished guests pretended not to notice that she did not belong among them. She had been invited as a courtesy, so society would say later. Her mother had once been companion to Lady Whitmore's elder sister, and the Woods, though respectable, possessed only a narrow cottage, a dwindling widow's annuity, and a surname too plain to survive long under the appetite of the aristocracy. Gertrude knew exactly how such invitations worked. A woman of modest means was welcome in fine company only so long as she was useful, decorative, or grateful. That afternoon, she intended to be none of those things. She had come because tucked inside the reticule hanging from her wrist were copies of letters her late father had hidden before his death. Letters linking the Harrow family to a land transfer that had stripped several tenant widows of income legally promised to them through the old Brooks Charitable Trust. Her father had once served as a legal copyist for minor estate matters. He had never been powerful, but he had been careful. And careful men, when they died too early, sometimes left behind truths large enough to ruin those who had laughed at them. Gertrude had barely crossed the lawn before Lady Celestine Harrow saw her. Celestine was beautiful in the manner of women who had never been denied anything except patience. Her gown blazed in rose silk. Pearls gleamed at her throat. The gentlemen around her bent instinctively nearer, not because she was kind, but because cruelty dressed in beauty had always fascinated the weak. "How brave of Miss Wood to attend," Celestine said, her voice carrying lightly over the clink of glass. "I had thought modest households preferred not to be seen in daylight." Several guests laughed. Gertrude did not. She had spent too many years learning that the first person to defend herself in a room like this was often the one condemned for causing a scene. "Daylight is useful," she said. "It shows stains very clearly." A few heads turned. Celestine's smile sharpened. Then came the moment the entire lawn would later repeat with delicious horror. A footman approached with wine. Celestine reached for a glass, turned, and with a movement so neat it could have passed for an accident to anyone who wished to lie, sent the red liquid spilling down the front of Gertrude's dress. The stain spread over pale lilac, like a wound opening in silk. Gasps rose. Someone whispered, "Oh dear." Someone else began, "How unfortunate," in the eager tone of a person encountering entertainment. Celestine lifted one elegant hand to her lips. "Miss Wood, forgive me. I cannot imagine how dreadful it must be to own only one suitable gown." This time the laughter came faster. Gertrude felt the wine cooling against her skin. She felt 100 eyes searching her face for the exact instant humiliation would break through discipline. She heard, dimly, one lady murmur that such accidents were why girls without proper staff should not attempt society. She saw Lord Edwin Harrow, Celestine's brother, who had once courted her just enough to borrow her father's knowledge, and then forgotten both, looking away as though cowardice were refinement. Gertrude did not cry. She did something far more dangerous. She looked directly at Celestine and said, "You meant to miss the cloth and strike the name." The lawn went still. Then a new silence entered the gathering, one far heavier than scandal. A tall man in black stood at the edge of the marble path, having evidently arrived unnoticed because the entire party had been too busy watching a smaller cruelty unfold. The Duke of Brooks did not often attend afternoon entertainments. Adrian Vale attended negotiations, parliamentary dinners, and funerals. He was spoken of as cold, formidable, and impossible to flatter. At 38, he had the reputation of a man who wasted neither money nor words. Mothers feared him because he was difficult to charm. Men feared him because he noticed too much. Women who dreamed of taming him usually stopped after one conversation and called him marble in human form. Now he looked not at Celestine, but at Gertrude. His gaze dropped once to the wine-soaked fabric, then lifted to her face, where no plea waited for him. "Who arranged this?" he asked. No one answered. Lady Whitmore fluttered that it had all been a misunderstanding. Celestine gave a brittle laugh. Edwin Harrow stepped forward as if he might smooth the moment into harmlessness. Adrian Vale ignored them all. He crossed the lawn with the measured stillness of a man entirely certain the ground belonged to him. When he stopped before Gertrude, the air around them seemed to tighten. "Miss Wood," he said, his tone grave and low, "do you wish to leave?" She met his eyes. They were a hard, restrained gray, but not indifferent. "Not yet, Your Grace." That answer changed something in his expression. Perhaps it was because most women in her position would have begged to disappear. Perhaps it was because he saw at once what others did not, that Gertrude Wood had come for a reason larger than pride, and that if she fled now, the people who had staged this humiliation would claim the entire narrative by dusk. Without looking away from her, he removed the heavy signet ring from his right hand. A murmur rippled across the garden. Then, with perfect deliberation, the Duke of Brooks took Gertrude's wine-stained hand and placed the ring upon her finger. The gesture was so intimate, so public, so impossible to misread, that for one stunned beat nobody on the lawn breathed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across every table. "Miss Wood stands under my protection." The words fell like iron. "No further insult to her name, person, or family will be offered in my presence," he continued. "If any guest finds that difficult, they may consider themselves unwelcome in every house where mine has influence." Color drained from Celestine's face. Edwin's jaw tightened. Lady Whitmore nearly collapsed under the weight of her own panic. Gertrude stared at the ring circling her finger. It bore the Brooks crest, a rearing stag beneath a coronet. Warm from his skin, heavy with authority, it felt less like ornament than a declaration of war. "Your Grace," she said, because she was the only one on that lawn disciplined enough to remember language, "that is a dangerous kindness." His gaze did not shift. "I did not intend it as kindness." "What then?" "A correction." He offered her his arm. The entire garden watched as Gertrude Wood, stained and publicly marked, took it. If you love stories where the woman they tried to disgrace walks back into the fire beside the one man powerful enough to stop the room, and where protection becomes alliance before it ever becomes love, stay with Quiet Fires of America, because Gertrude Wood's ruin had just failed in public. Adrian did not take her into the house at once. He led her instead through a side terrace lined with white roses to a small withdrawing room where only one maid, old enough to have no fear of gossip, waited with water, linen, and silence.
"Thank you," Gertrude said after the maid had gone. She stood near the window, fingers resting against the signet ring, as though she still did not trust it to be real. Adrian closed the door. "You may return it now, if you like." She looked up. If I do, they will say you regret it. Yes, and if I keep it for an hour, they will say something far more useful." A flicker touched his mouth. "You were not invited here merely to be humiliated." "No? What did you come to do?" She hesitated, measuring him. He seemed a man made entirely of edges, coat lines, cheekbones, principles. Yet he had not asked whether she was hurt. He had asked what she had come to do. That alone placed him in a different class from the well-bred men she had known. "My father left papers," she said. "Proof that the Harrows and one of their allies diverted income from the Brooks Widows' Trust after the old boundary revision near South Mere. Several tenant widows lost pensions. My mother's annuity was reduced in the same confusion. He intended to place the matter before a magistrate, but he died before he could act." Adrian went still in a deeper way. "The Brooks Widows' Trust," he repeated. "Say that again." She drew the packet from her reticule. "These are copies. The originals are hidden elsewhere. My father feared papers had a way of disappearing when rich families grew anxious." He took the letters and scanned the first page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, but enough. "There are trustees' marks on these," he said. "Yes, one is your late uncle's. Another belongs to Henry Foss, who now advises the Harrows." Adrian lifted his eyes to hers. "Do you understand what you are alleging?" "I understand that my mother has spent 3 years cutting coal in half and pretending not to notice winter. I understand that 2 widows on Brooksland moved in with married daughters because their promised stipends vanished after a transfer no one could properly explain. And I understand that Lord Edwin Harrow courted me just long enough to learn which drawer in my father's desk held the copy ledgers." Adrian said nothing. Then, "You did not come here hoping for sympathy. You came because the Harrows were gathered in one place and could not deny they knew you." "Yes. And the humiliation?" "Designed to make me look ridiculous before I spoke." He set the letters down very carefully. "Miss Wood, if these documents are authentic, this is not merely social malice. It is theft under the cover of rank. That has always been the most fashionable kind." For the first time, he looked at her, not as a woman requiring rescue, but as a mind standing opposite his own. "Keep the ring until evening," he said. "Return to the lawn with me. Let them spend the next hour wondering whether they have made an enemy of my future Duchess." Gertrude's pulse struck once, hard. "Your Grace," she said, "you do not know me." "No," Adrian replied, "but I know a forged account when I see one, and I know the look of a woman who came prepared to stand alone." When they returned together, the garden changed shape around them. No one laughed now. Celestine's smile had become rigid enough to crack porcelain. Edwin attempted a smooth apology that Adrian cut off with one glance. Lady Whitmore insisted Miss Wood must remain for tea. Gertrude accepted with serene composure and spent the next 40 minutes allowing every eye on the lawn to feast on the Brooks ring blazing against her stained glove. By nightfall, half the county believed the Duke of Brooks intended to marry beneath himself. The other half believed he intended something even more alarming: to investigate. Both were useful. The days that followed bound Gertrude and Adrian into an alliance neither had foreseen. He sent his solicitor, Mr. Nathaniel Crewe, to examine the copies. Gertrude produced more: letters, receipts, a notebook in her father's hand, and a list of widows whose payments had shrunk after the boundary revision. Adrian, in turn, opened the Brooks estate archives to her, a privilege that startled every servant and infuriated every relative who learned of it.
"You are allowing her into the West Records room?" his aunt demanded. "I am allowing competence into the West Records room," Adrian said. Gertrude heard of that remark by evening. She should not have treasured it, yet she did, because competence was the only dowry she had ever fully owned. Together they uncovered the true scheme. Years earlier, while Adrian's father was ill and his uncle managing portions of the estate, several charitable parcels had been temporarily reassigned during a drainage and fencing project near South Mere. Henry Foss, then a legal advisor hungry for influence, had engineered wording vague enough to let trustee income pass through Harrow-managed accounts before reaching its beneficiaries. Some of the money had been delayed. Some administrative costs had multiplied. Some stipends had vanished entirely. When Gertrude's father questioned discrepancies, Edwin Harrow began courting her, not out of affection, but to discover how much the Woods possessed in writing. When her father died, the Harrows assumed the danger had gone with him. They had not reckoned on a daughter who read ledgers as if they were battlefields. But the fraud was only one layer. A second discovery struck nearer the heart. In a sealed bundle from the Brooks archive, Adrian found correspondence between his mother and Gertrude's father. Years ago, when Adrian's younger sister Marianne had nearly died of fever in a winter storm, it was Thomas Wood who had ridden through the night to bring the surgeon from Stanton. He had stayed long enough to copy emergency legal papers because Adrian's father had been too frantic to think clearly. In gratitude, the Duchess Dowager had promised that the Wood family would always have a claim on Brooks' protection should hardship ever come. The promise had never been publicly spoken. Adrian had been abroad at the time, but it was there, in his mother's unmistakable hand. Gertrude read the letter twice, then lowered it with trembling fingers. "My father never told me," she whispered. "He may have considered it a debt he hoped never to call in," Adrian said. She looked up at him. "And yet you placed your ring on my hand before you knew this." "Yes." "Why?" He was silent long enough that another man might have filled the pause with elegance. Adrian did not waste himself that way. "Because they wanted to see you break," he said at last. "And I found I disliked the thought of giving them the satisfaction." It was not a confession, not yet, but something warmer than strategy moved beneath it. As the inquiry widened, society sharpened around them. Celestine spread whispers that Gertrude had trapped the Duke with theatrical vulnerability. Edwin implied she had stolen private papers. Henry Foss urged delay, procedure, and quiet settlement, the preferred language of men who feared daylight. Several ladies, having first mocked Gertrude's poverty, now reinvented themselves as her sympathetic well-wishers. Gertrude learned to smile at all of them. She also learned that Adrian's coldness was not emptiness, but discipline. He noticed whether she had eaten during long record sessions. He ordered fires lit in rooms before she arrived, because her hands grew cold when she worked. When she argued a point of trust law with Mr. Crewe, Adrian listened, not indulgently, but seriously, as if her mind altered the architecture of the room. For a woman who had spent years being politely underestimated, that respect was more intimate than flirtation. One evening, as rain struck the library windows, Gertrude asked the question she had avoided. "If we win," she said, "what becomes of me?" Adrian, standing by the hearth, looked at her steadily. "You mean after society decides whether to call you bold or dangerous?" "Those are usually the same thing when applied to women." "And if I say I do not care what society calls you?" She held his gaze. "Then I should ask whether you are accustomed to not caring, or merely powerful enough to afford it." A slow, rare smile touched his mouth.
Both, he said. Then, after a beat, Gertrude, if we win, the trust income will be restored, Foss will be removed, the Harrows will pay restitution, and every drawing room in Virginia will choke on the fact that a copyist's daughter forced them into honesty. And me? His eyes lowered briefly to the ring still resting on her finger. You, he said quietly, will have to decide whether my protection has become an insult, because I find I no longer wish to offer you only that. She could not answer, not because she did not understand him, but because she did. The final confrontation came 3 weeks later at Brooks Hall, during the formal trustees' dinner Adrian himself convened. He invited magistrates, neighboring landholders, the remaining trust beneficiaries, Lady Whitmore, the Harrows, Henry Foss, and enough witnesses to make silence impossible. Candles blazed down the length of the hall, silver gleamed. Reputation sat at every place-setting like
a loaded pistol. Celestine entered in triumphant emerald. Edwin wore injured dignity. Foss had the pale confidence of a man who believed technicalities could still save him. Gertrude wore ivory silk with no ornament except the Brooks signet ring. When the ladies withdrew after supper, Adrian did not rise to open cards or politics. Instead, he stood and said, "No one will be withdrawing anywhere." The hall froze. "Miss Wood," he said, turning slightly, "if you please." Gertrude rose. She had imagined this moment in anger, in fear, in sleepless calculation. But when it came, she felt only clarity. She laid before the trustees the letters, the copied ledgers, the stipend lists, the records of reduced payments, and finally the private correspondence proving Edwin Harrow had targeted her family to locate and suppress the evidence. Then she spoke, not as a wounded woman demanding pity, not as a social inferior begging belief, but as the daughter of a careful man who had left truth in order when his own life ran out. She named the boundary, revision. She named the diverted funds. She named Henry Foss's wording, Edwin's interference, Celestine's staged humiliation, and the deliberate attempt to disgrace her before she could present the evidence. When Foss interrupted, Adrian silenced him with a single command. When Edwin called the papers stolen, Mr. Crewe produced authenticated archive matches. When Celestine laughed and asked whether society would take the word of Miss Wood over the Harrows, 3 tenant widows stood from their chairs and answered before anyone else could. "We will," said Mrs. Bell, her hands shaking but her voice clear, "because we buried husbands on promised land and froze in houses your accounts forgot." That was the moment the room turned. Edwin felt it. Celestine felt it. Henry Foss, at last, truly felt it. By the time the magistrate requested the packet for immediate examination, the Harrows' confidence had split. By the time the dinner ended, Foss had been ordered to surrender relevant papers by morning. By the next week, restitution proceedings began. The widows' stipends were restored. Public notice spread that the Harrows had misused trust administration for personal advantage. Celestine's beauty survived the scandal. Her influence did not. As for Edwin, he attempted one final approach, meeting Gertrude in the gallery at Brooks Hall 2 days after the hearing. "You were never meant to be harmed," he said, as though rearranging language might alter memory. Gertrude looked at him with a calm so complete it frightened him more than anger would have done. "No," she said, "I was meant to be small. You only call it harm now because it failed." He had no answer to that. When he left, Adrian stepped from the shadowed doorway where he had clearly heard enough. You could have destroyed him more cruelly, he said. I know. Why did you not? Gertrude turned toward the window, where late gold light lay over the lawns. Because I wanted justice, not his habits. Something in Adrian's face changed then, something final. He came to stand before her, close enough that the whole world seemed to quiet itself in respect. You have done what many born to power never manage, he said. You have held it without becoming ugly in the hand. She tried for lightness and failed. That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. His mouth softened. Then he took her hand, the one that had first worn his ring in scandal, and said, with none of the performance society used to decorate love, Gertrude Wood, I placed my protection on you in anger. I offer you my name in reverence. Will you marry me? She had imagined, once, that if she were ever asked in earnest, she might cry. Instead, she laughed, small, startled, radiant, and answered the only way true to the life she had lived. Yes, she said, but only if the widow's accounts are audited every year. Adrian's rare smile appeared in full. Done. They married in autumn, when the first gold had entered the Brooks woods. Society called her transformation astonishing, because society always preferred miracles to labor. They said Gertrude Wood had gone from stained disgrace to Duchess of Brooks in a single season, as if the distance had been crossed by a ring alone. They were wrong, as such people often were. She became Duchess not because a powerful man chose to shield her, but because when cruelty tried to make her disappear, she stood still long enough to be seen clearly, and when truth asked something difficult of her, she did not turn away. At Brooks Hall she restored the trust, expanded the tenants' relief accounts, and kept her father's old notebook in the desk where estate decisions were made. Adrian, who had once lived as if feeling were an administrative inconvenience, discovered that devotion could be as steady as law and far more dangerous to a guarded heart. On winter evenings, he would find her in the library, head bent over household papers, candlelight touching the same disciplined face he had first seen above a wine stain, and a room hungry for shame. Sometimes he would take her hand, turn the signet ring gently with his thumb, and look at her as if remembering the exact moment the world had made the mistake of trying to humiliate the wrong woman. And Gertrude, no longer poor in anything that mattered, would look back with the calm certainty of a duchess who had built her place not out of favor, but out of truth, endurance, and a love strong enough to begin in public cruelty and end in shared strength.